Hey everyone, today I'll be telling a story about what it was really like to cook your first meal in the wild. So sit back and make sure to subscribe for more videos like this. You know that feeling when the power goes out during a storm, and suddenly your whole kitchen becomes about as useful as a screen door on a submarine? The microwave just sits there like an expensive paperweight. The electric stove might as well be a coffee table. Even your gas grill seems to mock you if you're out of propane or the igniter decides to take the night off. Most of us have been there, standing in a dark kitchen, flashlight in hand, wondering how our grandparents managed to feed families without flipping a switch or turning a dial. Maybe you've got some crackers in the pantry, or you fire up the camping stove you bought for that fishing trip 3 years ago. You make do, you get by. But what happens when there's no pantry, no camping stove, no corner store just down the road? What happens when it's just you, whatever you can carry, and the kind of hunger that makes your stomach feel like it's trying to digest itself? That's where this story begins. Not with some survival expert who's been living off the land since he could walk, but with regular guys like us who found themselves staring at raw meat and a pile of sticks, trying to figure out how our ancestors managed to not starve to death. See, there's something about cooking your first real meal in the wild that strips away all the modern conveniences and gets down to something more basic, more essential. It's like the difference between changing your oil at Jiffy Lube and crawling under your car in the garage with a socket wrench and a prayer. Both get the job done, but only one teaches you what's really happening under the hood. Why every man should know this now. You might be thinking, I've got a perfectly good kitchen at home. Why would I want to cook over a fire like some caveman? Fair question. But here's the thing. Knowing how to cook in the wild isn't really about the wild. It's about understanding something fundamental that most of us have forgotten. It's about the confidence that comes from knowing you can take care of yourself and the people you're responsible for, no matter what gets thrown your way. Think about it. Our grandfathers knew how to fix their own cars, build their own shelves, and yes, cook a meal without plugging anything into a wall. They had what we call old-school competence, the kind of skills that made them feel capable and self-reliant in a way that's getting harder to find these days. When Hurricane Katrina hit, or when the Texas freeze knocked out power for days, who do you think felt more confident? The guy who knew his way around a fire and could cook a decent meal with basic tools? Or the guy whose biggest cooking challenge was deciding between takeout and delivery? But it goes deeper than emergency preparedness. There's something primal and satisfying about cooking over an open fire that you just can't get from a gas range. It connects you to thousands of years of human experience. Every man who ever lived knew how to make fire, cook food. Somewhere along the way, we decided that was somebody else's job. Maybe it's time to take it back. What your gas grill won't teach you. Here's what I learned the hard way. Cooking on your backyard grill is like driving an automatic transmission. It works fine, gets you where you need to go, but it doesn't really teach you how the engine works. You turn the knob, you get heat. You press the igniter, you get flame. Everything is measured and controlled and predictable. Cooking in the wild is like learning to drive a stick shift on a hill in San Francisco during rush hour. Suddenly, every little thing matters. The wind direction, the moisture in the wood, the size of your fire, the height of your cooking surface. Things you never had to think about because your kitchen took care of them for you. Take temperature control, for instance. On your gas grill, you've got those nice little settings: low, medium, high. Turn the knob, adjust the heat. Simple. In the wild, your thermometer is your hand held at different distances from the coals. 5 seconds at hand level means hot. 10 seconds means medium. 15 seconds means you're probably not going to burn anything, but you might be eating raw meat for dinner. And that's just the beginning. Your gas grill has nice, even heat distribution. Those little flavor bars or lava rocks spread everything out nice and uniform. In the wild, you've got hot spots and cool spots and dead zones where nothing's going to cook except maybe your patience. Your kitchen has running water for cleanup, for putting out flare-ups, for washing your hands after handling raw meat. In the wild, that bottle of water you brought better last you the whole trip, because running to the sink isn't an option anymore. But here's what your gas grill really can't teach you: how to pay attention, how to read the signs, how to adjust on the fly when things go sideways, how to work with what you've got instead of what you wish you had. Those are skills that transfer to a lot more than just cooking. The real lessons start with hunger. You want to know when you really learn something, when the stakes matter, when there's something real on the line. At home, if you mess up dinner, you can order pizza. If you burn the steaks, there's a freezer full of backup options. If the power goes out, there's probably a restaurant within walking distance that still has power. In the wild, if you screw up your one meal, you go to bed hungry. If you waste your food, there's no corner store to bail you out. If you can't get your fire going, you're eating trail mix for dinner and hoping it doesn't rain. That's when you start paying attention, like your life depends on it. Because, in a small way, it does. I remember talking to my buddy Dave about his first solo camping trip up in Montana. Dave's the kind of guy who can rebuild a carburetor with his eyes closed and has never met a home improvement project he couldn't tackle. Real handy guy, confident. So when he decided to spend a long weekend by himself up near Glacier, he figured cooking a few meals over a campfire would be the easy part of the trip. How hard could it be, right? Fire plus food equals dinner. He'd been grilling in his backyard for 30 years. 3 days later, he came home 10 pounds lighter and with a whole new respect for what his grandmother could do with a wood-burning stove. "I thought I knew how to cook," he told me. "Turns out I knew how to operate cooking equipment. There's a difference." That difference is what we're going to explore in this story. The difference between operating equipment and actually understanding how heat and food and time work together. The difference between following instructions and developing judgment. The difference between convenience and competence. What we're going to cover over the next 7 parts, we're going to walk through what it's really like to cook your first meal in the wild. Not the sanitized version you see on camping shows, where everything works perfectly and the host makes it look easy. The real version. The version with mistakes and frustrations and small victories and hard-won lessons. In part 2, we'll start where every beginner starts, staring at a pile of sticks and stones and trying to figure out how they're supposed to turn into a kitchen. You'll see why everything you think you know about cooking suddenly feels useless when there's no outlet to plug into. Part 3 is about that first breakthrough moment when you actually get a fire going, and the immediate reality check when you realize that fire and cooking are 2 completely different skills. We'll talk about the universal first meal disaster that teaches you more in 30 minutes than years of backyard grilling. Part 4 gets into the nitty-gritty of when everything goes wrong. And trust me, everything will go wrong. We'll cover the burned outside, raw inside syndrome that plagues every beginner, and why smoke seems to follow you no matter where you move. In Part 5, we'll talk about the conversation that changes everything. The old-timer's advice that turns disasters into decent meals. You'll learn why coals beat flames every single time, and why patience isn't just a virtue in the wild, it's survival. Part 6 covers those first small wins and why they're more dangerous than the failures. Success breeds overconfidence, and overconfidence in the wild can literally burn you. We'll also get into the quiet lessons about wind and weather that no one tells you up front. Part 7 is about that breakthrough meal, the one where everything finally comes together and you realize you can actually do this without poisoning yourself or anyone else. It's about the moment when hunger meets skill, meets confidence somewhere in the middle of nowhere. And Part 8 wraps it all up with what this whole experience teaches you about yourself and why these lessons matter more in our push-button world, not less. Plus, we'll give you a realistic roadmap for starting your own first meal journey without repeating all the same mistakes. Why this matters now. You might be wondering why this is worth your time. After all, we live in an age of convenience. Food delivery apps, meal kit services, restaurants on every corner. Why learn to cook over an open fire when you can have dinner delivered to your door in 30 minutes? Here's the thing. It's not really about the cooking. It's about what happens when you strip away all the modern conveniences and get down to something basic and essential. It's about the confidence that comes from knowing you can handle yourself when things get primitive. It's about connecting with something that every man who came before us knew how to do. But more than that, it's about the kind of thinking that wilderness cooking teaches you. Problem solving with limited resources. Paying attention to details that matter. Working with what you have instead of what you wish you had. Making adjustments on the fly when your first plan doesn't work out. Those are skills that transfer to every part of life. Whether you're dealing with a broken down car on a back road, a power outage during a storm, or just the satisfaction that comes from knowing you can take care of yourself and the people you're responsible for. In a world that seems designed to make us more dependent and less capable, there's something powerful about proving to yourself that you can still handle the basics, that you can take raw ingredients and turn them into something nourishing, using nothing but fire and skill and patience. Our grandfathers knew this. They understood that being able to provide, to create something from nothing, to solve problems with your hands and your brain, was part of what made a man feel like a man. Maybe it's time we remembered that. The journey ahead. What you're about to read isn't a how-to manual. There are plenty of those already, and most of them make it sound easier than it is. This is the real story of what it's like to learn this skill from scratch. The frustrations and small victories. The mistakes that teach you more than any instruction manual ever could. You'll meet guys who figured it out through trial and error, old-timers who shared their wisdom, and hopefully you'll recognize something of yourself in their struggles and breakthroughs. Because here's the truth. Every man who ever learned to cook in the wild started exactly where you are right now, uncertain, maybe a little intimidated, probably wondering if it's worth the effort. But somewhere between that first failed attempt and that first successful meal, something changes. You start to understand that you're capable of more than you thought. That the difference between convenience and competence is smaller than it seems. That there's a satisfaction in doing something with your own hands that no amount of modern technology can replace. The journey starts with staring at a pile of sticks and stones and trying to figure out how they're supposed to become dinner. It's harder than it looks, more rewarding than you expect, and it teaches you things about yourself that you can't learn any other way. Ready to see what that looks like? Picture this. You're standing in a clearing somewhere in the mountains, maybe 40 miles from the nearest McDonald's, with a backpack full of good intentions and a cooler that's starting to feel like a joke. The sun's getting lower, your stomach's starting to rumble, and you're looking around at what's supposed to be your kitchen for the next few days. No countertops, no sink, no outlet anywhere in sight. Just trees and rocks and dirt and the kind of silence that makes you realize how much noise civilization makes. In your pack, you've got a nice piece of steak that cost you $12 at the grocery store, some potatoes, maybe an onion, real food, good food, the kind of meal that would take you 20 minutes to throw together at home. But home feels like it's on another planet right now. You're holding this raw steak, and for the first time, it really hits you. There's no gas grill with nice even burners, no oven with a digital temperature display, no microwave for warming up the sides, no running water to wash your hands after handling the meat. Just you, the wilderness, and the growing realization that everything you know about cooking just became about as useful as a chocolate teapot. The Great Kitchen reality check. There's a moment that hits every guy the same way, whether he's a weekend warrior trying car camping for the first time, or an experienced outdoorsman taking his first shot at cooking something more ambitious than hot dogs over a campfire. It's the moment when you realize that your kitchen at home wasn't just a room with appliances. It was a life support system. Every convenience, every control, every backup plan you took for granted is suddenly gone. My friend Rick described it best. Rick's a master electrician who can wire a house from scratch and troubleshoot problems that leave other contractors scratching their heads. Guy knows his way around tools and problem solving. But when he decided to take his son on a father-son camping trip and cook their meals the authentic way, he had what he calls his humbling moment. "I stood there holding this package of chicken breasts," he told me, "and I realized I had no idea what to do with them. I mean, I knew what to do with them at home. Season them, throw them on the grill, flip them once, check the temperature with my instant read thermometer. 20 minutes, done. But out there, I had no grill, no thermometer, no timer except my watch, no backup plan if I screwed up. And my 10-year-old is looking at me like I'm supposed to have this figured out because I'm the dad." That's the reality check. At home, cooking is mostly about operating equipment that's designed to do the hard work for you. Temperature control, the manufacturer figured that out. Even heat distribution, built into the design, safety features, automatic shutoffs, and warning lights. In the wild, you're not operating equipment. You're working with the fundamental forces of heat and combustion and chemistry that the equipment was designed to control for you. It's like the difference between driving a modern car with power steering, anti-lock brakes, and stability control, and trying to handle a 1950s pickup truck with manual everything. Both will get you down the road, but one requires a lot more skill and attention from the driver. The gear trap. Here's where most beginners go wrong, and I include myself in this category. When faced with the challenge of wilderness cooking, the first instinct is to try to recreate your home kitchen in portable form. So you start shopping. Camping stoves that look like miniature versions of your range at home, portable grills with temperature gauges, coolers that claim to keep things cold for a week, Dutch ovens and cast iron skillets, and enough gear to outfit a chuck wagon. The camping stores love guys like us. We walk in thinking we can buy our way to competence, that the right equipment will make up for lack of experience. Don't get me wrong, good gear has its place. But here's what I learned the hard way. Gear without skill is just expensive stuff that takes up space in your truck. I remember my first serious camping cooking setup. I bought a 2-burner camp stove that looked like it belonged in a restaurant kitchen, cast iron Dutch oven, folding table, portable sink with a pump. I had more gear for cooking outdoors than my grandfather had in his actual kitchen. And you know what? That first meal was still a disaster. Because gear doesn't teach you how to read a fire. Equipment doesn't tell you when your coals are ready or how to adjust for wind. All the fancy tools in the world won't help you if you don't understand the basics of how heat and food work together. It's like buying a workshop full of power tools and expecting to be a master carpenter. The tools are just tools. The skill comes from understanding the materials you're working with and developing the judgment that only comes from experience. What your home kitchen was really doing. To understand why wilderness cooking feels so foreign at first, you need to understand what your kitchen at home was actually doing for you behind the scenes. Take temperature control, something so basic we never think about it. At home, you turn your oven to 350 degrees, and an hour later, it's still 350 degrees. Turn your stovetop to medium, and it stays at medium until you change it. The equipment maintains consistent temperature automatically. In the wild, your heat source is constantly changing. Your fire burns hot at first, then settles down. Wind makes it flare up. Rain makes it struggle. Adding wood changes everything. The temperature you had 5 minutes ago might be completely different now. Your home oven has even heat distribution. Hot air circulates around your food, cooking it from all sides at the same rate. Your stovetop burners are designed to spread heat evenly across the bottom of your pan. Over a campfire, you've got hot spots and cold spots and everything in between. One side of your pan might be screaming hot while the other side is barely warm. The heat comes from below and gets blocked by whatever you're cooking, so the top of your food stays cool while the bottom burns. At home, you've got instant feedback. Timer goes off, food is done, smoke alarm tells you if something's burning. The smell of gas warns you if something's not lighting properly. In the wild, your feedback system is your senses and your experience. The sound of sizzling that tells you things are going well. The smell that warns you something's starting to burn. The visual cues that let you know when it's time to flip or move or add more fuel to the fire. Your kitchen at home also has built-in safety features, automatic shutoffs if something overheats, venting systems to remove smoke and grease, fire suppression systems in commercial kitchens, guards and shields to keep you from burning yourself. Outdoor cooking is full of ways to hurt yourself if you're not paying attention. Hot coals that don't look hot, grease that spits and pops, smoke that changes direction with the wind, and suddenly you're standing in a cloud that makes your eyes water and your lungs burn. The learning curve nobody warns you about. Here's what no one tells you when you're getting into wilderness cooking. There's a learning curve, and it's steeper than you think. At home, you learn to cook gradually. Maybe you started with simple stuff in college, ramen noodles and scrambled eggs. Then you moved up to more complex dishes as your confidence grew. Pasta with sauce, grilled chicken, maybe eventually some more ambitious projects. But the whole time, you were learning within a system designed to be forgiving. If you messed up the timing, you could adjust the heat. If something started to burn, you could move it to a different burner. If disaster struck, you could start over or order takeout. Wilderness cooking doesn't give you that gradual on-ramp. You're thrown into the deep end right away. Your first meal has to work because it's the only meal you've got. There's no practice round with low stakes. And the skills don't transfer as directly as you'd think. Being able to grill a perfect steak on your gas grill at home doesn't automatically mean you can cook that same steak over an open fire. The heat source is different. The feedback is different. The variables you have to control are different. It's like being an experienced driver and then trying to fly a plane. Some of the concepts are similar, but the execution requires a completely different set of skills. The first reality: everything takes longer. The first thing that hits you is time. Everything takes about twice as long as you think it should, and 3 times as long as it would at home. At home, you want to cook some potatoes, you wrap them in foil and throw them in a 400-degree oven for an hour. Consistent heat, predictable results. Over a campfire, those same potatoes become a project. First, you have to build a fire and let it burn down to coals. That's 30 minutes right there if you know what you're doing. Then you have to figure out how to create an oven-like environment with your coals. Then you have to maintain that environment for the hour it takes the potatoes to cook. Oh, and you have to do all this while also cooking your main course and any sides you might want. At home, you can run multiple things at once because you've got multiple burners and an oven that all work independently. Over a fire, everything has to share the same heat source. You're constantly moving things around, adjusting positions, adding wood, redistributing coals. It's like trying to cook a full meal on a single burner at home, except that burner doesn't have consistent heat and keeps trying to set things on fire. The second reality: your senses are your instruments. At home, you rely on tools to tell you what's happening. Timers tell you when things are done. Thermometers tell you if your meat is cooked to a safe temperature. The digital display on your oven tells you exactly how hot it is. In the wild, your tools are your eyes, your ears, your nose, and your sense of timing. You learn to recognize the sound of proper sizzling versus the sound of burning. You learn what properly cooking meat smells like versus what burning fat smells like. You develop what old-timers call fire sense, the ability to look at a bed of coals and know whether they're ready for cooking, to hold your hand at different heights above the fire and gauge the temperature, to predict how long your current heat source will last before you need to add more fuel. These aren't skills you can learn from a book or a YouTube video. They come from experience, from paying attention, from making mistakes and figuring out what went wrong. It's like learning to drive before power steering and anti-lock brakes. You had to develop a feel for the car, an understanding of how it responded to different inputs under different conditions. Modern cars do a lot of that thinking for you. Wilderness cooking makes you do all the thinking yourself. The third reality: simplicity is deceptive. When you start researching wilderness cooking, a lot of the advice sounds really simple. Build a fire, let it burn down to coals, cook your food over the coals. How hard could that be? But simple isn't the same as easy. There's a difference between understanding the concept and being able to execute it consistently. Building a fire sounds simple until you're trying to do it with damp wood in a crosswind. Letting it burn down to coals sounds straightforward until you realize that different types of wood create different types of coals, and the weather affects how long it takes, and you need to time it so your coals are ready when you want to start cooking. Cooking food over coals sounds obvious until you discover that over can mean 6 inches or 2 feet, depending on what you're cooking and how hot your coals are, and that you need to adjust constantly as the coals cool down. It's like being told that driving a car is simple. Press the gas to go, press the brake to stop, turn the wheel to change direction. All true, but knowing those concepts and being able to navigate traffic in downtown Chicago are two very different things, the equipment versus skill debate. This brings us to the central tension that every wilderness cooking beginner faces. How much should you rely on equipment versus developing actual fire and cooking skills? On one side, you've got the gear-heavy approach. Portable gas stoves, electric grills that run off your truck's power, propane-powered everything. This approach tries to recreate your home kitchen experience as closely as possible. On the other side, you've got the minimalist approach. Learn to cook over an open fire with basic tools. Develop the skills our ancestors used. Embrace the challenge and the connection to traditional methods. Most beginners think they have to choose sides. But here's what I learned from guys who've been doing this for decades. It's not really an either-or decision. The gear can be useful, especially when you're learning. A camp stove gives you consistent heat while you're developing your sense of timing and temperature. A good thermometer helps you learn what properly cooked meat looks and feels like, so you can eventually gauge it without instruments. But if you rely on gear too heavily, you never develop the underlying skills. You become dependent on your equipment, which means you're stuck if something breaks, or you forget something important. The guys who are really good at wilderness cooking tend to use both approaches strategically. They've developed the basic skills to cook over an open fire with minimal tools, but they're not too proud to use modern equipment when it makes sense. It's like being a good mechanic. A master mechanic can diagnose a lot of problems by listening to the engine and feeling how the car runs. But he's also going to use electronic diagnostic tools when they give him better information faster. What nobody tells you about the first time. Here's what all the camping books and YouTube videos leave out. Your first attempt at cooking a real meal in the wild is probably going to be humbling, not because you're incompetent or unprepared, but because you're learning to work with variables you've never had to consider before. Wind direction, wood moisture content, altitude effects on cooking time, how much smoke is normal versus how much smoke means you're about to set the forest on fire. You're also learning to work without the safety nets you're used to. No backup plans, no corner store to run to if you mess up, no ability to start over easily if things go wrong. And you're learning all this while you're hungry, possibly tired from a day of hiking or setting up camp, and maybe feeling a little pressure to prove that this whole wilderness adventure was a good idea. It's a lot to process all at once. But here's the thing. Every guy who's ever mastered wilderness cooking went through this same experience. The frustration of watching your dinner burn while you try to figure out why the heat is so uneven. The disappointment of cutting into meat that looks perfect on the outside but is still raw in the middle. The embarrassment of producing a meal that's technically edible but nowhere near what you had in mind. Those aren't signs that you're doing something wrong. They're signs that you're learning something new and challenging. Something that requires not just knowledge but judgment. Not just technique, but intuition. The promise beyond the frustration. But there's something on the other side of that initial frustration that makes it all worthwhile. It's the moment when things start to click. When your fire burns down to perfect coals right when you need them. When your meat cooks evenly and comes out exactly how you wanted it. When you take that first bite of a meal you cooked entirely with your own skills and basic tools. That moment connects you to something fundamental, to thousands of years of human experience, to the satisfaction that comes from creating something nourishing from raw materials using nothing but fire and skill and patience. It also teaches you something about yourself, that you're more capable than you thought, that you can learn new skills even when they're frustrating at first, that there's a deep satisfaction in doing something with your own hands that no amount of modern convenience can replace. But to get to that moment, you first have to get through the learning process. You have to make the mistakes, deal with the frustrations, and develop the judgment that only comes from experience. And that journey starts with your first real attempt at getting a fire going and using it to cook something more ambitious than hot dogs or marshmallows, which is exactly where we're headed next. There's a moment every man remembers from his first serious attempt at wilderness cooking. It's not the moment when everything goes perfectly, because that doesn't happen the first time. It's the moment when you finally get a real fire going and you feel like you've conquered something fundamental. You've got flames reaching up toward the sky, crackling and popping like a fire is supposed to. The smell of burning wood fills the air. Maybe you even managed to get it going without using half a bottle of lighter fluid or one of those fancy fire starter blocks. You used actual skill, actual technique, the kind of knowledge that separates the men from the boys. For about 10 minutes, you feel like Daniel Boone and Paul Bunyan rolled into one. You've mastered fire, the most basic human technology. You're connected to every generation of men who came before you, all the way back to the first guy who figured out how to make sparks turn into flames. And then reality hits you like a cold shower, because getting a fire going, it turns out, is just the beginning. Fire isn't cooking. Fire is just the raw material for cooking. It's like having a workshop full of power tools, but no idea how to use them to build anything useful. The moment of truth. Let me tell you about Tom's first attempt. Tom's a retired engineer, the kind of guy who can design a bridge or troubleshoot a complex manufacturing problem without breaking a sweat. Methodical, logical, good with his hands. He figured wilderness cooking would be right in his wheelhouse. He'd done his homework, read books about campfire cooking, watched YouTube videos, even practiced building fires in his backyard fire pit until he could get one going reliably every time. So when he and his brother decided to spend a long weekend fishing up in northern Minnesota, Tom volunteered to handle the cooking duties. He brought thick ribeye steaks, planning to cook them the first night to celebrate their successful escape from civilization. He got his fire going perfectly, good dry wood, proper structure, flames dancing just like in the videos. He was feeling pretty confident about his fire building skills. This isn't so hard, he thought. I don't know what all the fuss is about. That's when he made the mistake that probably 90% of beginners make. He slapped those steaks right over the flames. For about 30 seconds, it seemed like it was working great. The meat was sizzling. The flames were licking up around the edges. Everything looked like a scene from a camping magazine. Tom was feeling pretty good about himself. Then the fat started to render. The flames got bigger. The outside of the steaks started to char, while the inside stayed cold. Grease dripped into the fire, causing flare-ups that singed his eyebrows and made him jump back. Within 5 minutes, he had what looked like 2 pieces of charcoal wrapped around raw meat. The outside was black and crispy in all the wrong ways. The inside was still mooing. I stood there holding these expensive steaks that I'd completely ruined, Tom told me later, and I realized I didn't know the first thing about cooking over a fire. I knew how to make fire, but I had no idea how to make fire cook food. That's the reality check that hits every beginner. Fire and cooking are 2 completely different skills. Why flames are your enemy. Here's what nobody tells you when you're starting out. Flames are terrible for cooking almost everything. Oh, they look impressive. They make you feel like you're really cooking over an open fire. But for most actual cooking, flames are about as useful as trying to paint your house with a fire hose. Think about it this way. At home, when you're grilling on your gas barbecue, what are you cooking over? Not flames. You're cooking over consistent, controlled heat that radiates up from the burners. The flames themselves are contained below the cooking surface, creating an even heat source. When you cook over an open campfire with flames, you're trying to cook with a heat source that's constantly changing intensity, constantly moving around, and constantly threatening to burn your food before it has a chance to cook through. It's like trying to solder delicate electronics with a blowtorch. The tool is way too powerful and way too unpredictable for the job you're trying to do. But here's the thing that makes it even more confusing for beginners. Flames look like they should work. In movies and TV shows, the rugged outdoorsman always seems to be cooking directly over big, impressive flames. It's part of the visual language of authentic outdoor cooking. In reality, those guys in the movies either have prop food that's already cooked, or they're using specially designed setups that control the heat, even though it looks like open flames. Or they're just getting great shots of food that's going to be terrible to eat. Real wilderness cooking happens over coals. Coals give you the consistent, controllable heat that actually cooks food instead of just charring the outside while leaving the inside raw. But getting from flames to coals requires patience, and patience is usually the first casualty when you're hungry and trying to prove you know what you're doing. The patience problem. This is where wilderness cooking starts to separate itself from modern cooking in ways that really matter. At home, when you want to cook something, you turn on the heat and start cooking. The heat is available instantly, consistently, and as long as you want it. With fire, you have to earn your heat. You build your fire, let it burn for a while, then let it burn down until you have a bed of coals that's actually suitable for cooking. This process takes time. Usually 45 minutes to an hour from the moment you light your first piece of kindling to the moment you have coals ready for cooking. And here's the kicker. You have to time this process so your coals are ready when you want to start cooking. Start too early and your coals burn down to ash before you're ready to use them. Start too late and you're standing around hungry, watching flames, waiting for them to settle down into something you can actually cook with. For guys used to instant gratification, this is a real adjustment. We're accustomed to deciding we want to cook something and then cooking it right away. The idea of starting your cooking process an hour before you want to eat feels almost primitive, but it gets worse. Once you have your coals, you have a limited window to work with them. Coals are hottest right after the flames die down. Then they gradually cool off. You can extend their life by adding more wood, but then you have to wait for that wood to burn down to coals too. It's like having a workshop where your power tools only work for 30 minutes at a time, and you have to wait an hour between uses to recharge them. This timing challenge is what catches most beginners off guard. They get their fire going, they're proud of their flames, they want to start cooking right away, so they try to cook over flames, and disaster follows. The heat control revelation. Even if you're patient enough to wait for coals, there's another learning curve that hits you right away. Heat control in wilderness cooking is nothing like heat control at home. At home, heat control is simple. Turn the knob to adjust the flame. Move your pan to a different burner if you need different heat. Put something in the oven if you want steady, even heat from all sides. Over coals. Heat control is a three-dimensional puzzle that requires constant attention and adjustment. First, there's distance. The closer your food is to the coals, the hotter it gets. Sounds simple, but how do you adjust that distance when your food is already cooking? You need some kind of adjustable grate, or you need to move your coals around, or you need to move your food to different areas of your cooking surface. Second, there's coal management. Hot coals for searing, medium coals for regular cooking, cooler coals for gentle heat. You need to arrange your coals to create different heat zones, like having multiple burners on your stove. This means moving around hot, glowing pieces of wood with tools that probably weren't designed for the job. Third, there's timing. Your coals are constantly cooling down. The heat you had when you started cooking isn't the heat you'll have 10 minutes later. You need to add more wood and wait for it to burn down. Or you need to rearrange your existing coals to concentrate the heat. Or you need to adjust your cooking method to work with lower heat. It's like trying to cook a meal while your stove randomly changes temperature every few minutes, and you have to physically rebuild it to get the heat you want. My buddy Frank, who spent 30 years as a machinist, put it this way: "At work, I could set a tolerance of plus or minus 0.02 of an inch and hold it all day long. But trying to maintain a consistent cooking temperature over a campfire, that was harder than anything I ever did in the shop. The classic first meal disaster. Almost everyone has the same first meal disaster, and it follows a predictable pattern. You get your fire going and you're proud of yourself. You've conquered fire. You're feeling confident, maybe a little impatient to get cooking and prove that this whole wilderness thing is going to work out great. So you put your food over the flames because, well, that's where the heat is, right? At first, everything seems fine. The food is sizzling, it sounds like cooking, it even smells like cooking. You're thinking this isn't so hard after all. But then you start to notice things going sideways. The sizzling gets more aggressive. Smoke starts to smell less like barbecue and more like something burning. If you're cooking meat, fat starts dripping into the fire, causing flare-ups that char the outside while leaving the inside untouched. You try to adjust, maybe move the food around, maybe move yourself around to get away from the smoke that seems to follow you no matter where you stand. Maybe try to control the flames somehow. But once things start going wrong over open flames, they tend to go wrong fast. What started as enthusiastic sizzling becomes aggressive burning. The outside of your food turns black while the inside stays raw. The smoke gets thick and acrid. If you're not careful, you can actually catch your dinner on fire. 10 minutes after you started cooking, you're standing there with food that's burned on the outside, raw on the inside, and smoky throughout. It's technically edible if you're hungry enough, but it's nothing like what you had in mind. And that's when the doubt starts to creep in. Maybe this whole wilderness cooking thing is harder than it looks. Maybe you're not cut out for it. Maybe you should have just brought sandwiches and called it good. This is the moment that separates the guys who keep trying from the guys who give up and stick to camp stoves and pre-made meals for the rest of their outdoor adventures. What the disaster teaches you. But here's the thing about that first disaster. It teaches you more about wilderness cooking than any book or video ever could, because now you've experienced firsthand what doesn't work. You've learned why flames are your enemy. You've felt the frustration of trying to control something that seems determined to burn your food. More importantly, you've learned that cooking over fire requires a completely different mindset than cooking at home. It's not about applying techniques you already know to a different heat source. It's about learning a fundamentally different way of thinking about heat and timing and control. The disaster also teaches you something about stakes. At home, if you mess up dinner, it's disappointing, but not a big deal. You can order pizza or dig something out of the freezer. In the wilderness, if you mess up your one good meal, you're eating trail mix for dinner and going to bed hungry. That raises the stakes in a way that forces you to pay attention like your life depends on it, because in a small way, it does. Tom, the engineer with the charred ribeyes, told me that his first cooking disaster was actually the most valuable part of his whole learning process. I realized I'd been approaching it like an engineering problem, he said. Like if I just followed the right steps in the right order, I'd get predictable results. But fire isn't like that. It's organic. It changes constantly. You can't control it the way you control a machine. You have to work with it. That's a profound shift for guys who are used to solving problems with tools and technology. Wilderness cooking requires developing a feel for something that can't be measured precisely or controlled completely. The moment you start to understand. But somewhere in the middle of that first disaster, something usually clicks. Maybe it's when you realize that the area around the edges of your fire, where there are coals but no flames, seems to be working better. Maybe it's when you accidentally drop something away from the direct heat and notice it's cooking more evenly. Or maybe it's when an experienced camper at the next site over takes pity on you and wanders over to offer some advice. You're cooking over flames, they'll say, as if that explains everything. Well, yeah, you might respond. Where else would I cook? And then they show you something that changes everything. They show you how to rake coals away from the main fire to create a cooking area with consistent heat and no flames. They show you how to test the heat by holding your hand at different distances from the coals. They explain why patience isn't just a virtue in wilderness cooking. it's survival. Suddenly, the whole enterprise makes sense in a way it didn't before. Fire isn't just about flames. Fire is about creating coals. Coals are your actual cooking surface. Everything before that is just preparation. It's like the moment when you're learning to drive a stick shift and suddenly understand that the clutch isn't just something you press to change gears. It's the connection between the engine and the transmission, and learning to feel that connection is what makes everything else possible. The science you never learned. Here's what nobody teaches you about fire and cooking, probably because most people learn to cook in kitchens where someone else has already solved these problems for you. Flames are combustion. They're the process of wood and oxygen combining to release energy. That energy is what creates heat, but flames themselves are inefficient for cooking because they're constantly moving, constantly changing intensity, and they can't be controlled precisely. Coals are wood that has already gone through most of the combustion process. They're mostly carbon, burning steadily at a high temperature without the dramatic flames. They give you consistent, radiant heat that you can control by adjusting distance and airflow. Think of it like the difference between a lightning bolt and a light bulb. Both produce light, but only one is useful for reading a book. When you cook over flames, you're trying to harness lightning. When you cook over coals, you're using a tool that's been refined by thousands of years of human experience to do exactly what you need it to do. But understanding this intellectually and being able to execute it consistently are two different things. The knowledge helps, but the skill comes from practice. Why most people give up. This is the point where a lot of guys throw in the towel on wilderness cooking. They've had their first disaster, they understand theoretically what they should be doing differently, but the gap between understanding and execution still feels enormous. The learning curve is steep, the margin for error is small, and the stakes feel high when you're hungry and you've just wasted your dinner. It's easier to fall back on camp stoves and pre-made meals. Easier to stick to hot dogs and s'mores. Easier to decide that real wilderness cooking is more trouble than it's worth. And you know what? For some people, that's fine. Not everyone needs to master every skill. There's no shame in using tools and techniques that work for you. But for guys who stick with it, who push through the frustration and the failures, there's something on the other side that makes it all worthwhile. Because once you start to understand fire, once you develop a feel for coals and timing and heat control, you realize you're learning something that connects you to every generation of men who came before you. Something that makes you more capable, more self-reliant, more confident in your ability to handle whatever gets thrown your way. The real learning begins. That first breakthrough moment, when you finally understand that fire and cooking are different skills, when you realize that patience isn't optional and that coals beat flames every time, that's not the end of the learning process. That's when the real learning begins, because now you understand what you're trying to do, but you still have to develop the judgment and the technique to do it consistently. You have to learn how to build and maintain the right kind of fire for cooking. You have to develop the timing to have your coals ready when you need them. You have to master the heat control that turns raw ingredients into properly cooked meals. And you have to learn all of this while dealing with variables you never had to consider at home. Wind that changes your fire's behavior, altitude that affects cooking times, weather that impacts everything from how fast your wood burns to how quickly your food cools down. The first breakthrough gives you hope. It shows you that this is possible, that other people have figured it out, that you can figure it out too with enough practice and patience. But it also shows you how much you still have to learn and how many ways things can still go wrong. Which brings us to the next phase of the journey, when everything that can go wrong does go wrong, and you start to understand why wilderness cooking has been humbling people for thousands of years. You know that feeling when you're working on a project in your garage and everything that can go wrong does go wrong? The drill bit breaks just as you're finishing the last hole. The wood splits right where you need it to be perfect. The measurements you double-checked turn out to be wrong somehow, and each problem creates two more problems that you didn't see coming. That's wilderness cooking after your first breakthrough. You understand now that you need coals instead of flames. You get the concept of heat control and patience. You've even managed to produce a few meals that were technically edible, maybe even decent. You're feeling like you're making progress, and then the wilderness decides to teach you some humility, because understanding the principles and being able to execute them consistently under real-world conditions are two completely different things. It's like the difference between knowing how to change a tire in your driveway and changing a tire on the side of the interstate in the rain with trucks flying by at 70 miles per hour. The conditions in the wild don't care about your newfound confidence. The wind doesn't stop blowing just because you finally figured out coal management. Your firewood doesn't dry out just because you need it to burn evenly. And your stomach doesn't stop growling just because you're still learning. The burned outside, raw inside blues. There's a cruel irony in wilderness cooking that every beginner discovers sooner or later. The better you get at building fires, the more ways you find to ruin your food. When you were cooking over flames, your food got burned, and you knew why. Too much heat, too fast, case closed. The solution was obvious, even if the execution was tricky. But once you start cooking over coals, you discover a whole new category of problems. Problems that seem to make no sense at first. Problems that make you question whether you actually understand anything at all. The classic example is what I call the perfect char raw center disaster. You've got your coals arranged just right. You've tested the heat with your hand. Everything feels under control. You put your steak on the grate, and it starts sizzling in that satisfying way that tells you things are going well. 5 minutes later, you flip it, and the bottom looks perfect. Nice char marks, good color, exactly what you were hoping for. You're feeling pretty good about yourself. 10 minutes after that, you pull it off the coals, let it rest, cut into it, and find a strip of perfectly cooked meat about a 1/4 inch thick wrapped around a center that's still stone cold. What the hell happened? My friend Dave, the guy who came back from Montana 10 pounds lighter, described this exact scenario from his second attempt at wilderness cooking. I thought I'd figured it out, he told me. The outside looked like something you'd get at a steakhouse, but when I cut into it, it was like the heat had only penetrated about as deep as a coat of paint. This is when you start to understand that heat management in wilderness cooking is way more complex than just hot coals equals cooked food. At home, your oven surrounds your food with hot air. Heat comes from all directions at once, penetrating slowly and evenly from the outside in. Your stovetop transfers heat through the bottom of your pan, which then distributes it relatively evenly across the surface of whatever you're cooking. Over coals, heat is mostly radiant, coming up from below in a concentrated beam. The top of your food stays relatively cool while the bottom gets hammered with intense heat. Unless you figure out how to manage this, you'll get that perfect char on the outside, while the inside never gets a chance to warm up. The solution involves things like creating heat zones, using indirect cooking methods, managing airflow, and developing a feel for when to move food around. All skills that take time to develop and patience to execute. But when you're hungry and you've just ruined another piece of expensive meat, patience is usually in short supply. When smoke becomes your enemy, then there's the smoke situation, which becomes its own special kind of torture as you're trying to learn heat management. When you were cooking over flames, smoke was just part of the deal. Big fire, lots of smoke, you worked around it. But now that you're trying to cook over coals with more precision, smoke becomes this constant, maddening presence that seems determined to make your life miserable. First, there's the basic physics of smoke behavior, which seems designed by the universe to frustrate anyone trying to cook outdoors. Smoke rises, but not straight up. It follows air currents, and air currents change direction based on wind, temperature differences, terrain, and apparently the phase of the moon. So you position yourself upwind of your fire, thinking you've solved the problem. Then the wind shifts, or the heat from your coals creates a downdraft, or some other mysterious force takes over, and suddenly you're standing in a cloud of smoke that makes your eyes water and your lungs burn. You move to the other side of the fire. The smoke follows you. You move again. It follows you again. It's like the smoke has developed a personal grudge against you and is determined to make you miserable. But here's what took me way too long to figure out. Smoke is actually trying to tell you something. It's feedback about what's happening with your fire that you're probably ignoring because you're too busy trying to get away from it. Thick white smoke usually means you've got wood that's not burning efficiently. Maybe it's too green or too wet, or you've smothered your coals by adding too much fuel too fast. The solution isn't to move away from the smoke, it's to fix whatever's causing the inefficient burn. Acrid, choking smoke often means you're burning something you shouldn't be. Maybe grease dripping from your food, maybe food particles that have fallen into the coals, maybe debris that got mixed in with your firewood. Again, the solution is to address the cause, not just avoid the effect. Smoke that keeps changing direction and seems to follow you around is often a sign of poor air circulation around your fire. Maybe you're cooking in a spot that's too sheltered, or maybe your fire setup is creating weird air currents that push smoke in unpredictable directions. Understanding this takes time and attention, and a willingness to think about what the smoke is telling you, instead of just cursing it and moving to get away from it. But when you're trying to manage heat and timing and food preparation all at the same time, analyzing smoke patterns feels like one problem too many. The great equipment betrayal. This is also when your gear starts to let you down in ways you didn't expect. Remember all that equipment you bought to make wilderness cooking easier? The folding grates and adjustable grills and clever little gadgets that were supposed to solve all your heat management problems? Turns out, most of that stuff works great in ideal conditions and fails spectacularly when conditions get real. Take adjustable grills, for example. Great concept. You can raise and lower your cooking surface to control how much heat your food gets. Should solve the burned outside, raw inside problem, right? Except the adjustment mechanism gets clogged with ash and grease. The legs sink into soft ground at uneven rates, tilting your entire cooking surface. The joints that seemed so solid in the store start to wobble after a few heating and cooling cycles. Or consider those fancy camp grills with built-in thermometers. Sounds like a perfect solution to the heat control problem. Just monitor the temperature and adjust accordingly. But the thermometer measures air temperature, not the radiant heat that's actually cooking your food. And it measures the temperature at one specific spot, not the heat variations across your entire cooking surface. So you end up with precise measurements of something that doesn't actually tell you what you need to know. The worst part is when your equipment fails at a critical moment. You're finally getting the hang of coal management. You've got your timing figured out. Everything is going according to plan. Then your grate collapses, or your tripod tips over, or some crucial piece breaks just when you need it most. Suddenly, you're trying to rescue your dinner while dealing with a gear failure, and both problems feed on each other until you end up with burned food and broken equipment. My buddy Frank, the machinist, had this happen with a fancy camping grill that cost him over $200. The height adjustment seized up right in the middle of cooking, he told me. I couldn't raise the grate, couldn't lower it, couldn't even get the food off without dismantling the whole thing. By the time I got it apart, dinner was charcoal. This is when you start to understand why old-timers tend to use simple, basic equipment that's harder to break and easier to improvise with when something goes wrong. The hunger factor. But maybe the worst part of this learning phase is the hunger factor. Because all these failures and equipment problems and frustrating experiments are happening while you're genuinely hungry and getting hungrier. At home, if you mess up dinner, you can order pizza while you're cleaning up the mess. If your stove breaks, there's a restaurant down the street. If you burn something, there's probably backup food in the freezer. In the wilderness, if you mess up your one meal, you go to bed hungry. If your equipment fails, you figure out how to make do with what you've got. Or you don't eat. If you burn your dinner, you eat burned food, or you eat trail mix. This creates a psychological pressure that makes everything harder. You're trying to learn complex new skills while dealing with the stress of knowing that failure means genuine discomfort. Every mistake has real consequences, which makes you more likely to make mistakes because you're anxious about making mistakes. It's like trying to learn to parallel park while someone is threatening to take away your car if you bump the curb. The hunger also makes you impatient, and impatience is the enemy of good wilderness cooking. You start taking shortcuts because you don't want to wait for your coals to reach the right temperature. You try to rush the cooking process because your stomach is growling. You make risky decisions because eating mediocre food seems better than waiting longer for good food. But wilderness cooking doesn't care about your hunger. The coals take as long as they take to reach the right temperature. The meat takes as long as it takes to cook through safely. Rushing the process just creates new problems that take even longer to solve. Tom, the engineer, described the psychological pressure perfectly. It's like being given a complex problem to solve while someone is standing behind you tapping their watch and asking if you're done yet. Except the person tapping their watch is your own stomach. The compounding failure effect. What makes this phase so frustrating is how failures tend to compound. One small problem creates two bigger problems, which create four even bigger problems, until you're dealing with a cascade of disasters that seems impossible to stop. You start with slightly damp firewood, which makes your fire burn inefficiently, which creates too much smoke, which forces you to position yourself where you can't see your food clearly, which leads you to overcook one side while undercooking the other, which forces you to try to fix the problem by moving things around, which disturbs your coal bed, which changes your heat distribution, which creates new hot spots and cool spots that you have to figure out all over again. Meanwhile, your equipment is getting covered with ash and grease, making it harder to use. Your workspace is getting cluttered with tools and ingredients and improvised solutions. Your timeline is getting shot because everything is taking longer than you planned. And through it all, you're getting hungrier and more frustrated and more likely to make the kind of desperate decisions that turn manageable problems into complete disasters. I remember one camping trip where I watched a guy go through this exact sequence. Started with a minor wind shift that blew ash onto his food. He tried to brush it off, which disturbed his coal arrangement. That created uneven heat, so he tried to rearrange the coals with a stick. The stick caught fire, so he had to deal with that. By the time he got everything sorted out, his food was burned on one side and raw on the other. His coal bed was a mess, and he was so frustrated, he was ready to throw the whole thing in the fire and eat cold sandwiches. This is the obstacle wall that stops a lot of people from progressing further with wilderness cooking. The gap between understanding the principles and being able to execute them consistently under real conditions seems enormous. Every time you think you're making progress, something goes wrong that reminds you how much you still don't know. The tool problem. Part of what makes this phase so difficult is discovering that your tools don't work the way you expected them to. Take something as basic as a spatula. At home, you use a spatula to flip things in a pan that's sitting on a stable, level surface. Easy. Over a campfire, you're trying to use that same spatula to flip food on a grate that might be tilted, unstable, or positioned awkwardly above a bed of coals. The handle gets hot. The angle is wrong. The leverage doesn't work the same way. What should be a simple operation becomes a frustrating exercise in trying to manipulate food without dropping it into the fire. Or consider tongs, which seem like they should be perfect for campfire cooking. Great for picking things up, moving them around, flipping them over. But campfire cooking requires constant adjustment and repositioning, which means you're using your tongs constantly. Your hands get tired, the tongs get hot. Food particles build up on the grippers, making them less effective. Even basic things like plates and cutting boards become challenges. At home, you've got counter space for prep work, a sink for cleanup, stable surfaces for everything. Over a campfire, you're balancing plates on uneven ground, cutting meat on a piece of wood that's propped up on a cooler, trying to keep everything clean while ash and smoke swirl around. The tools that seemed so practical when you bought them start to feel clumsy and inadequate when you're actually trying to use them in real conditions. This is when you start to understand why experienced wilderness cooks tend to use simple, basic tools that are easy to clean, hard to break, and versatile enough to handle multiple jobs. Weather as your opponent, and then there's weather, which becomes a constant factor that affects everything you're trying to do. Wind changes how your fire burns, how your smoke behaves, how fast your food cooks, and how comfortable you are while you're cooking. A steady breeze might help your fire burn hotter and cleaner, but it also blows ash around and makes it harder to control your temperature precisely. Temperature affects how long everything takes. Cooking at altitude in cold weather means longer cooking times, more fuel consumption, and different techniques than you'd use at sea level in warm weather. Humidity affects how your firewood burns, how quickly your food cools down once it's off the heat, and how long it takes for things to dry out if they get wet. And rain? Rain is the great equalizer that reminds you just how dependent your cooking is on conditions you can't control. Wet wood won't burn properly. Wet coals won't maintain consistent heat. Wet equipment becomes slippery and dangerous. Wet conditions turn every simple task into a challenge. I remember one trip where the weather forecast called for clear skies all weekend. We planned elaborate meals, brought fresh ingredients, looked forward to cooking over open fires under the stars. Instead, we got intermittent drizzle that wasn't quite heavy enough to drive us into our tents, but was persistent enough to make fire management nearly impossible. Every time we got a good coal bed established, moisture would dampen it down. Every time we tried to add wood, it would smolder instead of burning cleanly. We ended up eating a lot of cold sandwiches and warm beer that weekend. But we also learned a lot about how much weather affects wilderness cooking and why experienced campers always have backup plans. The mental game. But maybe the hardest part of this obstacle phase is the mental game. The constant string of failures and setbacks starts to wear on your confidence. You begin to wonder if you're cut out for this, if maybe you're just not the kind of guy who can master wilderness cooking. Every mistake feels like evidence that you don't know what you're doing. Every equipment failure feels like proof that you chose the wrong gear. Every burned meal feels like confirmation that this whole enterprise was a mistake. The guys who push through this phase are the ones who understand that the obstacles aren't a sign they're failing. The obstacles are the curriculum. Every problem you encounter is teaching you something you need to know. Every failure is showing you a mistake you won't make again. But knowing that intellectually and maintaining that perspective when you're hungry and frustrated and dealing with your third cooking disaster of the day are two different things. This is where a lot of guys give up, where they decide that wilderness cooking is more trouble than it's worth, where they fall back on camp stoves and simple meals and tell themselves they never really wanted to master this skill anyway. And you know what? That's fine. Not everyone needs to push through every challenge. There's no shame in deciding that your time and energy are better spent on other things. But for the guys who stick with it, who push through the frustration and keep trying despite the setbacks, there's a breakthrough waiting on the other side of all these obstacles. A moment when all the pieces suddenly click into place. When the skills you've been struggling to develop finally start to work together. When you realize that the obstacles weren't trying to stop you, they were trying to teach you. That's where we're headed next. Sometimes the most important conversations happen when you least expect them. You're at your lowest point, ready to throw in the towel, convinced you're just not cut out for whatever challenge you're facing. And then someone who's been down that road before shows up and shares exactly what you need to hear. For me, that conversation happened at a campground outside Yellowstone on what was shaping up to be the most frustrating cooking experience of my life. I'd been at this wilderness cooking thing for about 6 months, long enough to understand the basics, but not long enough to execute them consistently. I could build a decent fire most of the time. I understood that coals were better than flames. I even had some equipment that worked reasonably well when everything went according to plan. But nothing was going according to plan that particular evening. The wind kept shifting, blowing smoke in my face no matter where I positioned myself. My firewood was burning too fast, creating flames when I needed coals. My grate was wobbling on uneven rocks, making it impossible to position food where I wanted it. And I was trying to cook chicken breasts that had to be done thoroughly but not dried out, which required exactly the kind of heat control I was struggling to master. 20 minutes into what should have been a simple cooking process, I had chicken that was charred on the outside and probably still raw on the inside, a fire that was burning too hot and too fast, and a growing certainty that I was going to end up eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner again. That's when Earl wandered over from the campsite next to mine, the conversation that changed everything. Earl was probably in his 70s, with the kind of weathered face that comes from spending serious time outdoors. He'd been watching my struggles with what I later realized was the patient amusement of someone who'd seen the same show many times before. "Mind if I offer some advice?" he asked, pointing at my fire with the stem of his pipe. At that point, I was ready to accept help from anyone who seemed to know what they were doing. "Please," I said. "I'm about ready to throw this chicken in the trash and call it a night." Earl nodded toward my fire. "What do you see when you look at that?" I looked at the flames dancing around my grate, the pieces of chicken that were beginning to look like charcoal, the smoke that was making my eyes water. "A disaster," I said. "I see someone fighting his fire instead of working with it," Earl said. "You're trying to force that fire to do what you want instead of learning what it wants to do." He walked closer to my setup, studying it the way a mechanic might look under the hood of a car. "Fire's like a tool," he said. "Hammer works great if you're driving nails. Terrible if you're trying to cut wood. Your fire right there, that's a hammer, and you're trying to use it like a saw." I must have looked confused, because he smiled and continued. "See those flames? That's not cooking fire, that's burning fire. Good for getting warm, good for light, terrible for cooking food. You need cooking fire, which is a different animal altogether." He pointed to his own campsite, where I could see a small fire with no visible flames, just a bed of glowing coals. "That's cooking fire." Took me about 40 minutes to get it to that point. Most folks aren't willing to wait 40 minutes when they're hungry. Earl walked back to his site and returned with a pair of long-handled tongs and what looked like a small shovel. "Mind if I show you something?" The technique that changes everything. What Earl showed me next was so simple, I almost couldn't believe it would work, but it was also so different from everything I'd been trying that it felt like learning a completely new skill. "First thing," he said, using his small shovel to rake coals away from the main body of my fire, "you separate your cooking area from your fuel area. Fire over here for making coals. Coals over here for cooking food." He created a small bed of coals about 2 feet away from my main fire, arranging them in a roughly rectangular pattern. Now you've got consistent heat without flames. No flare-ups, no constant changes in temperature, no smoke blowing in your face because there's nothing left to burn. He tested the heat by holding his hand about 6 inches above the coals. 5 seconds before I have to pull my hand away means hot. 10 seconds means medium. 15 seconds means low. Your hand is the only thermometer you need. Then he showed me something that seemed almost too simple to be useful. He arranged the coals so they were deeper on one side than the other, creating what he called heat zones. Hot side for searing, medium side for cooking through, cool side for keeping things warm, he explained. It's like having 3 burners on your stove, except they're all connected so you can slide your food from one zone to another without picking it up. He rescued my chicken from the disaster I'd created, moved it to the medium zone of his coal bed, and within minutes it was cooking evenly without burning. The difference was so dramatic, it was almost embarrassing. "But how do you maintain the temperature?" I asked. "Don't the coals just cool down?" Earl pointed back to the main fire. That's your coal factory. Every 15-20 minutes, you rake some fresh coals over to your cooking area. Replace the ones that are cooling down. As long as you keep that fire burning, you've got all the coals you need. He made it sound so obvious that I wondered why I'd been making it so complicated. Why nobody tells you this. First, after Earl got my dinner back on track and I was eating properly cooked chicken for the first time in weeks, I asked him something that had been bothering me. Why doesn't anyone teach this technique first? Why do all the camping books and videos start with cooking over flames? Earl packed his pipe thoughtfully before answering. Couple of reasons, he said. First one is that cooking over flames looks more dramatic, makes for better pictures. Folks see those big flames and think that's what real campfire cooking looks like. He gestured toward his modest coal bed, which was producing perfect cooking heat without any visual excitement. This doesn't look like much, doesn't make you feel like a mountain man, but it works every time. Second reason is patience, he continued. Most folks want to start cooking as soon as they get their fire going. They don't want to wait 40 minutes for coals to develop. They want instant gratification, like they're used to at home. That hit close to home. I'd definitely been guilty of trying to start cooking as soon as I had flames, even when I knew intellectually that I should wait for coals. But the main reason, Earl said, is that nobody teaches the coal technique first, because it's not really a technique. It's a whole different way of thinking about fire. He pointed to my original fire, which was still burning with plenty of flames. When you cook over flames, you're trying to control the fire. Make it do what you want when you want it. That's a fight you can't win because fire has its own nature. Then he pointed to his coal bed. When you cook over coals, you're working with fire's nature. You're using the product of combustion instead of trying to control combustion itself. Fire wants to burn wood and turn it into coals. You let it do that, then you use the coals for cooking. It was like the difference between trying to tame a wild horse and learning to work with a trained one. Both approaches might get you where you want to go, but one requires fighting and the other requires partnership. The mental shift. That conversation with Earl changed more than just my cooking technique. It changed how I thought about the whole challenge of wilderness cooking. Before that night, I'd been approaching it like a problem to be solved. I had techniques to master, equipment to operate, variables to control. When things went wrong, I tried to fix them by applying more technique, better equipment, tighter control. Earl showed me that wilderness cooking is less like operating a machine and more like working with a partner. Fire has its own personality, its own preferences, its own natural tendencies. Fighting those tendencies is exhausting and usually unsuccessful. Working with them is easier and more effective. It's like the difference between forcing a stubborn bolt with a bigger wrench and figuring out why the bolt is stuck in the first place. Sometimes the harder you fight, the more problems you create. Sometimes the solution is to step back, understand what's really happening, and work with the natural forces instead of against them. This mental shift affected everything about how I approached wilderness cooking. Instead of trying to force my fire to burn at exactly the temperature I wanted, I learned to build the kind of fire that naturally produced the coals I needed. Instead of fighting smoke, I learned to position my fire and manage my fuel in ways that minimized smoke production. Instead of getting frustrated when things didn't go according to plan, I started paying attention to what the fire was telling me and adjusting my approach accordingly. The science behind the Magic Earl's technique worked so well that I wanted to understand why. So I started paying attention to the science behind what he'd shown me. Flames are the visible part of combustion, the reaction between fuel and oxygen that releases energy. But flames are also unstable. They flicker and dance and change intensity based on airflow, fuel moisture, ambient temperature, and a dozen other variables. When you try to cook over flames, you're trying to harness that unstable energy for a task that requires consistent, controllable heat. It's possible, but it requires constant attention and adjustment. You're always fighting to maintain the right conditions. Coals are what's left after the volatile compounds in wood have burned off. They're mostly carbon, burning at a steady rate and producing consistent radiant heat. They don't flicker or dance or change dramatically based on minor variables. They just burn steadily until they're consumed. The difference in heat quality is like the difference between a strobe light and a steady lamp. Both produce light, but only one is useful for tasks that require consistent illumination. Coals also give you thermal mass, which flames don't provide. A good bed of coals stores heat energy and releases it gradually. That thermal mass helps even out temperature fluctuations and provides more forgiving cooking conditions. When you understand this, Earl's technique makes perfect sense. You're not just following steps, you're working with the natural properties of combustion to create the best possible cooking conditions, the setup that works. Once I understood the principles, I started experimenting with Earl's approach and developing my own variations. Here's what I learned about setting up a coal-based cooking system that works consistently. First, you need the right kind of fire for coal production. Not a big, roaring bonfire that burns through fuel quickly and produces mostly flames. You want a moderate fire built with good hardwood that burns down to substantial coals. The fire should be sized to produce coals at the rate you need them. Too small, and you'll run out of coals before your food is done. Too large, and you'll waste fuel and create more heat than you can use effectively. Second, you need a way to move coals from your fire to your cooking area safely and efficiently. A small shovel or coal rake is essential equipment, not an optional accessory. Trying to move coals with sticks or improvised tools is frustrating and dangerous. Third, you need to think about your cooking area layout. Your coal bed should be positioned where you can access it easily without reaching over or through your main fire. You should have space to arrange coals in different heat zones. And you should have room to work without getting smoked out or burned. The actual coal bed should be large enough to accommodate whatever you're cooking with room for heat zones. Hot area for searing, medium area for general cooking, cool area for keeping things warm, or finishing thick cuts slowly. Earl taught me to think of it like setting up a workbench. Everything should be positioned for efficiency and safety. Tools where you can reach them easily. Materials organized so you can find what you need quickly. Workspace arranged so you can move around without bumping into things or getting hurt. The first real success. The first time I used Earl's technique for a complete meal from start to finish, I felt like I'd crossed some kind of threshold, not just in cooking skill, but in understanding what it meant to work with fire instead of against it. I was camping with my brother up in the Adirondacks, and I'd volunteered to cook dinner the first night. Instead of the usual anxiety about whether I could pull it off, I felt confident in a way I'd never experienced with wilderness cooking before. I started by building a proper coal fire, sizing it to produce enough coals for the full meal I had planned. While it burned down, I prepped my ingredients and organized my tools. No rushing, no pressure, just methodical preparation. When my coals were ready, I raked out a cooking bed and arranged it in zones just like Earl had shown me. Hot zone for searing the steaks, medium zone for cooking them through, cool zone for keeping the vegetables warm while everything finished. The whole process felt different than my previous attempts. Instead of constantly fighting problems and making emergency adjustments, I was working through a planned sequence. The heat was predictable and controllable. The timing worked out the way I'd expected it to. When we sat down to eat, my brother took a bite of his steak and said, "This is as good as anything I've had at a restaurant. What did you do different?" I tried to explain Earl's technique, but I realized that the real difference wasn't just the method. It was the confidence that came from understanding what I was doing instead of just hoping things would work out. For the first time, I felt like I was actually cooking over a fire, not just heating food in the general vicinity of combustion. The compound effect. Once you master the basic coal technique, everything else about wilderness cooking starts to make more sense. Skills that seemed impossible when you were fighting flames become manageable when you're working with consistent heat. Temperature control becomes intuitive. You develop a feel for how different coal arrangements create different heat patterns. You learn to read the visual cues that tell you when your coals are at the right temperature for different types of cooking. Timing becomes predictable when you know your heat source is going to remain consistent. You can plan your cooking sequence with confidence. You know how long things will take, when to start each component of your meal, how to coordinate multiple dishes. Food quality improves dramatically. Consistent heat means even cooking. No more burned out sides with raw centers. No more overcooking while you try to compensate for uneven heat distribution. But maybe most importantly, the stress level drops way down. When you're not constantly fighting fires and dealing with emergencies, you can actually enjoy the cooking process. You can pay attention to flavors and techniques instead of just trying to avoid disasters. This is when wilderness cooking starts to become satisfying instead of just challenging. When you start to understand why people choose to cook over fires even when they have other options available. The hidden lessons. Earl's technique taught me more than just how to manage coals. It taught me lessons about patience, observation, and working with natural systems instead of against them. The patience lesson was probably the most important. Modern life trains us to expect instant results. We want immediate gratification, quick fixes, solutions that work right away. Earl's approach required me to slow down, plan ahead, accept that some things can't be rushed. Building a fire and waiting for it to produce usable coals takes time. There's no shortcut, no way to speed up the process without compromising the results. You either accept the timeline or you don't get the benefits. But that patience pays dividends throughout the entire cooking process. When you start with proper coals, everything else becomes easier and more predictable. The observation lesson was about learning to read the signs that tell you what's really happening. Instead of just following steps mechanically, you learn to pay attention to visual cues, sounds, smells, and timing that give you feedback about how things are progressing. You learn to recognize the difference between coals that are ready for cooking and coals that need more time. You develop an eye for heat distribution, an ear for the sounds of proper cooking, a nose for the smells that tell you when things are going well or starting to go wrong. Most importantly, you learn that the fire is always communicating with you. The question is whether you're paying attention to what it's trying to tell you. Why this changes everything. Earl's coal technique wasn't just a better way to cook over a fire. It was a completely different relationship with fire that made everything else possible. Before that conversation, I was trying to impose my will on a force of nature. I wanted the fire to behave like a kitchen appliance, providing consistent, controllable heat on demand. When it didn't cooperate, I got frustrated and tried harder to force compliance. After learning to work with coals, I started thinking of fire as a partner in the cooking process. I provided the fuel and the setup. Fire provided the heat energy, and we worked together to create the conditions needed for good cooking. This partnership approach made complex cooking techniques suddenly seem achievable. Multi-course meals that required different types of heat for different components. Slow cooking methods that required hours of consistent temperature. Even baking techniques that seemed impossible over an open fire. The confidence that came from mastering basic coal management created momentum for learning more advanced skills. Instead of dreading each cooking session and hoping I could avoid disaster, I started looking forward to trying new techniques and tackling more challenging recipes. But the real transformation was psychological. I went from feeling like wilderness cooking was something I was bad at to feeling like it was something I could learn to do well. From seeing problems as evidence of my incompetence to seeing them as opportunities to develop new skills. That shift in mindset changed everything about how I approached not just cooking, but other challenging skills as well. The path forward. Earl's technique solved the fundamental heat management problem that had been making wilderness cooking so frustrating. But mastering coal management was just the foundation for everything that came next. With consistent, controllable heat, I could finally start working on all the other skills that make the difference between surviving and thriving in wilderness cooking. Understanding how different foods respond to different types of heat, learning to coordinate multiple components of a meal, developing the timing and sequencing that let you serve everything hot and properly cooked. Most importantly, I could start building the confidence that comes from knowing you can handle whatever challenges come up. Because with solid fundamentals, you can adapt to changing conditions, recover from mistakes, and turn basic ingredients into satisfying meals consistently. That confidence becomes the foundation for everything else. For trying more ambitious recipes, for cooking in more challenging conditions, for developing your own techniques and approaches. But confidence can also be dangerous if it's not balanced with humility and continued learning. Because once you start having consistent success, it's easy to get overconfident and start taking shortcuts that can lead to new kinds of problems. Which is exactly what happened to me next, and probably what happens to most people who push through the initial learning curve and start feeling like they've got this wilderness cooking thing figured out. Success is a funny thing. When you're struggling to master something new, you dream about that moment when everything finally clicks. When the skills you've been practicing start to work consistently. When you can execute techniques that used to feel impossible. But success brings its own set of challenges that nobody warns you about. Because once you start having consistent wins, once you develop confidence in your abilities, once you feel like you've got this thing figured out, that's when you're most likely to make the kinds of mistakes that can really hurt you. I learned this lesson the hard way about 3 months after my conversation with Earl. I'd been using his coal technique consistently, and it was working like magic. I could produce evenly cooked meat, manage multiple dishes at once, even tackle more complex recipes that required precise heat control. Friends were starting to ask me for cooking advice on their camping trips. I was feeling pretty good about my wilderness cooking skills. Maybe too good. The taste of victory. There's nothing quite like the satisfaction of nailing a complex meal over an open fire. When everything comes together exactly the way you planned it. When your timing works out perfectly and you're serving multiple dishes that are all cooked properly and still hot. When you take that first bite and realize you've created something that would be impressive even in a well-equipped kitchen. I remember the meal that made me feel like I'd really figured this out. I was camping with 3 other guys up in Montana, and I'd volunteered to handle dinner for the group. Instead of playing it safe with simple grilled meat and vegetables, I decided to get ambitious. The menu was surf and turf, ribeye steaks with grilled shrimp, roasted potatoes with herbs, and sautéed mushrooms. 4 different components that required different cooking techniques and precise timing to bring together into a cohesive meal. I started my fire early, built it properly, let it burn down to perfect coals. I set up multiple heat zones, hot for searing the steaks and shrimp, medium for finishing the meat, low for keeping the potatoes warm while everything else cooked. The whole process unfolded like a choreographed dance. I got the potatoes started first, since they'd take the longest. While they were cooking, I prepped the other ingredients and organized my workspace. When the potatoes were almost done, I moved them to the low heat zone and started the steaks on the hot zone. Perfect searing, then a move to medium heat to cook through to exactly the right doneness. Add the shrimp to the hot zone for a quick sear. Start the mushrooms in a cast iron pan over medium coals. Everything timed so it would finish at the same moment. 20 minutes later, I was plating 4 restaurant-quality dinners that had been cooked entirely over an open fire with basic tools. The steaks were perfectly medium rare with a beautiful crust. The shrimp were tender and flavorful. The potatoes were creamy inside with crispy skins. Even the mushrooms had that perfect sauté texture that's hard to achieve over a fire. My camping partners were genuinely impressed. "This is better than most steakhouses," one of them said. "How did you learn to do this?" I felt like I'd crossed some kind of threshold, from beginner to competent practitioner, from someone who was struggling to avoid disasters to someone who could execute complex techniques with confidence. That feeling of mastery was intoxicating and dangerous. The overconfidence trap success has a way of making you forget how hard things were when you were learning. The struggles and failures and frustrations start to seem like ancient history. You remember the breakthrough moments and the victories, but the details of what it took to get there become fuzzy. This selective memory creates a dangerous kind of overconfidence. You start to think that the skills you've developed are more robust than they actually are. You begin to believe that you can handle variations and challenges that would have destroyed you when you were starting out. More importantly, you start taking shortcuts. When you were learning, you were meticulous about following proper procedures. You built your fire carefully, waited patiently for proper coals, tested your heat zones, organized your workspace. You did these things because you knew that skipping steps led to disasters. But once you start having consistent success, those careful procedures begin to feel like overkill. You think, I know what I'm doing now. I don't need to be so cautious about everything. So you start cutting corners. You don't wait quite as long for your coals to develop properly because you're hungry and you think you can make it work. You don't test your heat zones as carefully because you've developed a good eye for these things. You don't organize your workspace as methodically because you're confident you can improvise if needed. Each shortcut seems minor and reasonable, and initially they might even work out fine. Your developed skills can compensate for less than perfect conditions. You can adjust on the fly when things don't go exactly according to plan, but what you don't realize is that you're slowly eroding the safety margins that were keeping you out of trouble. You're moving closer to the edge of your actual capabilities without recognizing how close you're getting. The first warning signs. The first signs of overconfidence are usually small problems that you're able to solve without major disasters. A piece of meat that's a little more done than you intended. Vegetables that get a bit charred because you weren't paying close attention. Timing that's slightly off so one dish is ready before the others. These aren't catastrophic failures, so they don't trigger the careful, methodical approach you used when you were learning. Instead, they feel like minor inconveniences that you can handle with your improved skills. My first warning sign came on a camping trip where I decided to cook breakfast for a group of 6 people. Normally, I would have planned this carefully, started early, made sure I had everything organized before I began cooking. But I was feeling confident about my abilities, and frankly, I wanted to sleep in a little longer. So I started the cooking process later than I should have, figuring I could make up time by working more efficiently. At first, everything seemed fine. I got my fire going quickly, raked out coals that looked adequate, started cooking bacon and eggs simultaneously to save time. I was multitasking like a short-order cook, managing multiple pans and keeping track of different cooking times. But because I'd rushed the coal development, my heat wasn't as even as it should have been. Some areas were too hot, others too cool. The bacon cooked unevenly, some pieces burning while others stayed undercooked. The eggs set too quickly on the bottom while staying runny on top. I was able to compensate by moving things around, adjusting constantly, using my experience to work around the problems I'd created. The breakfast was edible, even decent, but it required a lot more effort and attention than it should have. More importantly, I spent the entire cooking process fighting small fires instead of executing a smooth plan. It was stressful rather than satisfying, reactive rather than controlled. A more experienced cook would have recognized this as a sign to slow down and be more careful about fundamentals. But I was just confident enough to think the problems were situational rather than systemic, environmental factors you don't see coming. One of the things that separates beginners from experienced wilderness cooks is understanding how environmental factors affect everything you're trying to do. When you're starting out, you're so focused on basic fire management and cooking techniques that you don't pay much attention to conditions around you. But as your basic skills improve, environmental factors become increasingly important. Wind patterns, elevation, humidity, ambient temperature, even the specific location where you set up your cooking area can make the difference between success and failure. Take wind, for example. When you're learning, you notice wind because it affects your fire behavior in obvious ways. Strong wind makes flames bigger and more erratic. It blows smoke around. It makes it harder to maintain consistent heat. But experienced cooks understand that wind affects cooking in much more subtle ways. Steady, gentle wind can actually improve your fire by providing consistent airflow that helps coals burn more efficiently. But gusty, variable wind creates unpredictable heat patterns that require constant adjustment. Wind direction matters too. Cooking with the wind at your back means smoke and sparks blowing toward your food and workspace. Cooking into the wind can help keep smoke away from you, but it can also create downdrafts that disturb your coal bed. Even the terrain around your cooking area affects wind patterns. Cooking in a hollow or depression can create dead air that makes smoke linger. Cooking on a ridge or exposed area can create wind shear that makes heat control unpredictable. I learned about terrain effects the hard way on a trip to Colorado. I set up my cooking area in what seemed like a perfect spot: level ground, good access to firewood, beautiful views of the mountains. What I didn't notice was that I was cooking in a natural wind tunnel created by the valley walls. Every time the wind picked up, it would funnel through the valley and hit my fire with concentrated force. This created extreme fluctuations in heat that made precise cooking nearly impossible. One minute, my coals would be burning steadily at medium heat. The next minute, a gust would turn them into a blast furnace that charred everything in seconds. Then the wind would die down, and I'd be left with rapidly cooling coals that couldn't maintain proper cooking temperature. An experienced cook would have recognized the terrain features that create these wind patterns and chosen a different location. But I was focused on convenience and aesthetics rather than understanding how the environment would affect my cooking. The altitude factor. Another environmental factor that catches confident cooks off guard is altitude. If you've developed your skills at sea level and then try to cook at high elevation, you'll discover that everything works differently. At altitude, water boils at lower temperatures, which affects cooking times for anything that involves moisture. Foods dry out faster because of lower humidity and thinner air. Fires burn differently because of reduced oxygen content. But the most surprising change is how much faster you can go from properly cooked to overcooked. The combination of drier air, different heat transfer characteristics, and faster moisture loss means you have less margin for error. I experienced this on a camping trip in the Rockies at about 8,000 feet elevation. I was cooking techniques I'd mastered at home in Michigan, using timing and heat control that had worked consistently for months. But everything cooked faster than expected. Meat that should have needed 20 minutes was done in 15. Vegetables that normally required careful monitoring to avoid overcooking were getting charred before I realized they were even close to done. The thin air also affected my fire behavior in ways I hadn't anticipated. Wood burned faster and hotter, requiring more frequent attention to maintain proper coal beds. The rapid temperature changes that come with mountain weather created constant adjustments in how my fire behaved. By the time I figured out the timing differences, I'd overcooked 2 meals and had to make significant adjustments to my planned menu for the rest of the trip. An experienced high-altitude cook would have known to expect these differences and adjusted accordingly. But my sea-level experience had made me confident in techniques that weren't as universal as I thought. Why location matters more than recipes. One of the biggest lessons of this phase is that location and environmental factors matter more than specific recipes or techniques. You can follow the same procedure in 2 different places and get completely different results. This is why experienced wilderness cooks spend time scouting and setting up their cooking area before they start any fire or food prep. They're not just looking for convenience or aesthetics. They're reading the environment and choosing locations that will work with their cooking process rather than against it. Good wilderness cooks look for natural windbreaks that provide protection without creating dead air. They consider drainage and ground conditions that affect setup stability. They think about access to water for cleanup and fire safety. They evaluate fuel availability and fire restrictions. Most importantly, they understand that adapting to local conditions is more important than rigidly following techniques that worked elsewhere. I remember talking to an old-timer who'd been camping and cooking in the backcountry for over 40 years. He told me that he'd never cooked the same meal exactly the same way twice. Not because I'm trying to be creative, he said, but because conditions are never exactly the same. Different wood burns differently. Different weather affects your fire differently. Different elevation changes how long everything takes. If you're not adapting constantly, you're fighting the environment instead of working with it. This adaptive approach requires a different kind of knowledge than what most people think of as cooking skills. It's less about following recipes and more about understanding principles well enough to modify them based on conditions. The hidden risks of confidence. But maybe the most dangerous aspect of this phase is how confidence can make you complacent about safety. When you're learning, you're hyper-aware of all the ways things can go wrong. You're careful about hot surfaces, conscious of fire hazards, methodical about cleanup and fire safety. As your skills improve and cooking becomes more routine, it's easy to become less vigilant about these basics. You've handled hot coals hundreds of times without getting burned, so you start being less careful about protection and positioning. You've managed cooking fires without incidents, so you start paying less attention to fire containment and safety protocols. This complacency can lead to accidents that are more serious than the minor burns and mishaps that happen when you're being extra cautious as a beginner. I know a guy who'd been wilderness cooking for years without any serious problems. He'd developed excellent skills and could cook complex meals under challenging conditions. But he'd also gotten casual about safety protocols. One evening, he was cooking dinner after a long day of hiking. He was tired, a little rushed, and not paying as much attention as he should have been. When he reached across his fire to adjust something on the far side of his cooking area, his sleeve caught on a piece of equipment, and he ended up putting his forearm directly on his grate. The burn was serious enough to require evacuation from the backcountry and medical treatment, an injury that could have been easily prevented with the kind of careful movement and awareness he'd practiced religiously when he was learning. I got comfortable, he told me later, started treating hot coals like they were just another tool instead of something that could really hurt me if I wasn't careful. This kind of complacency is one of the hidden dangers of developing competence in any skill that involves real hazards. The better you get, the more routine it becomes, and the easier it is to forget that the dangers haven't gone away just because you've learned to manage them. The momentum of success. Despite these hidden dangers, the momentum that comes from consistent success is incredibly powerful. Each meal that turns out well builds your confidence and motivation to try more challenging techniques. Each problem you solve successfully increases your belief that you can handle whatever comes next. This momentum is what transforms wilderness cooking from a survival skill to a craft. From something you do because you have to, into something you do because you enjoy the challenge and the satisfaction. I found myself looking forward to cooking over fires in ways I never had before, planning more elaborate meals, trying techniques I'd read about but had been afraid to attempt, even seeking out challenging conditions because I wanted to test my skills. This enthusiasm led me to try cooking methods that had seemed impossibly complex when I was struggling with basics. Dutch oven baking that required precise temperature control for hours, multi-course meals that demanded careful timing and coordination, even smoking techniques that required managing low, steady heat for most of a day. Each successful experiment built on the last one, creating a positive feedback loop that made me want to push further and try more ambitious projects. But this momentum also made me overestimate my abilities and underestimate the challenges I was taking on. I started attempting techniques and taking on cooking projects that were at or beyond the edge of my actual skill level, which set me up for the kind of high-stakes failure that teaches you more about your limitations than a dozen small successes ever could. The setup for the final test. By the time I'd been practicing Earl's coal technique for about 6 months, I was feeling pretty confident about my wilderness cooking abilities. I could handle most of the basic techniques consistently. I could adapt to different conditions and recover from minor problems. I could even execute some fairly complex recipes that impressed other campers. That confidence led me to accept a challenge that, in retrospect, was probably beyond my skill level at the time. A group of friends was planning a week-long backcountry trip in the North Cascades. Remote area, no road access, everything packed in on our backs. And they asked if I'd be willing to handle all the cooking for the group. Not just simple trail meals, but real dinners that would make the long days of hiking feel worthwhile. Fresh ingredients for at least the first few days. Elaborate meals that would justify the extra weight we'd be carrying. I said yes, without really thinking through what I was committing to. I was confident in my abilities, excited about the challenge, and eager to show off what I'd learned. But cooking for a group in the backcountry is different from cooking at established campgrounds with car access and convenient facilities. The margin for error is smaller. The consequences of failure are higher. And all the environmental factors that affect wilderness cooking are amplified when you're in truly remote locations. I was about to learn that there's a big difference between being competent under controlled conditions and being able to perform under pressure when everything is on the line. That lesson was waiting for me in the mountains, where the combination of challenging conditions, high stakes, and my own overconfidence would create the kind of test that separates people who've learned some techniques from people who've truly mastered the craft. Click the other video on screen now